Hello. The purpose of this video is to describe how interviews are used in political science and offer a few tips on how to read articles that use them. First off, I'd like to address why political scientists use interviews in the first place. In the statistical research we've read, we've talked a little bit about measurement bias on that front, how individual pieces of data may not fully represent the concepts that they are intended to. One big advantage of interview research is that you don't have that problem. You can ask people open-ended questions and really get a full picture of whatever it is that you're talking about. Because interviews go into a lot of detail, it also allows researchers to really explore the connections between cause and effect. Statistical research will show you that two variables are related, but it doesn't necessarily demonstrate that one caused the other. Interview research gets you closer to being able to do that. Finally, researchers often also use interviews when they are learning about something new. The idea here is that you're building a theory instead of testing an already existing theory. You use interviews in this case because you don't necessarily know what variables you're talking about or how you might actually want to measure those variables. So interview research is actually my favorite research to do. I think it's a lot of fun, but it does tend to produce slightly longer articles because you're actually putting a bunch of people's quotes in there. I do want to acknowledge the disadvantages of interview research as well, though. The two most important ones are a different type of measurement bias than the measurement bias you see in statistical research. Here, it's not the specificity of the data that you're looking at, it's how can you actually tell whether respondents gave you honest and complete answers. People lie all the time, and under certain circumstances, they might actually be more likely to lie than others. In addition, there's a trade-off between the depth of information you get in an interview and the breadth in terms of the number of people you can talk to. Researchers need to be very careful to make sure that they aren't talking to only a select group of people who are giving them the answers that they want to hear. So when you have an article that uses interview research, you want to ask yourself two big questions. First, try to identify what the purpose of the research actually is. Are they describing a new concept or a new theory, or are they testing a theory? Articles that test theories are structured very similarly to statistical research and other academic articles. Because I've covered that before, and because the articles we read this week are actually describing concepts and theories, I'm going to focus on what you do with those types of articles and how you evaluate the quality of the interviews themselves. To summarize, you want to look at how the researcher decided who to talk to and whether or not the evidence actually supports the argument. Before I go through an example and talk in more detail about how to evaluate that evidence, I want to introduce just a couple of terms to you all that are used in interview research. First off is this idea of sampling. We talk about this in survey research a lot, but it also applies to interview research as well. You need to understand the author's population of interest. Who is it that they were actually trying to get information about? And then what their sample was. Who did they actually talk to? In surveys, the gold standard is what's called a random sample. If you randomly choose people to speak to, you're much more likely to be certain that they actually represent the population you're trying to study. In interview research, though, random sampling is very difficult and actually not always desirable. You're much more likely to see convenience sampling, which is I'm going to talk to whoever is willing to talk to me, or snowball sampling, where the researcher asks each interviewee to recommend a few other people to speak to. These two methods are very practical, but they can also introduce bias into the results, because the type of people who are willing to speak to you and the type of people they recommend to you may not fully represent the population you're trying to study. So you always want to look for what did the author do to try and avoid this problem? How did they select who to speak to in order to represent their population of interest? In addition, sometimes authors will talk about the types of interviews they did, whether they were structured, whether you're asking everyone the same questions, unstructured, you're asking just open-ended questions, or somewhere in between. Just wanted to introduce that vocabulary so it didn't surprise you. So, how do you evaluate interview evidence specifically? First off, you look at how many people the researcher spoke to. In general, more is better, but also you want to get a sense of how many out of the population of interest did they speak to, and did they actually represent the group of people the author said they wanted to study? Second, you look at the quality of the interviews. This is to get at the idea of, were the respondents actually being honest? How did the author evaluate the honesty and completeness of the responses? And then, what do you think about the honesty and completeness of responses? Make your own assessment, don't just take the author's. Last, you want to evaluate the links between evidence and theory. Essentially, this comes down to whether the interviews said what the author said they did. Do they actually fully describe the concepts or the variables that the author is using? And do the respondents actually describe the cause-effect relationship the author is interested in by themselves? Or is the author the one making those connections? Are they using the interviews as evidence pointing to a specific result? Both of these are fine. In general, it's desirable for a respondent to say, yes, this cause you think is there is exactly correct. But more often, the author is interested in studying something a bit broader, or that may not be fully apparent to the interviewees themselves. I'd like to show you some of what I'm talking about by using the article Patchwork Leviathan by Erin Macdonald. Macdonald unfortunately does a very bad job of describing her theory in clear language, but essentially it comes down to this idea that she is interested in studying variation within bureaucracies in the quality of the bureaucratic agency. So skim. What I'd like to point out here is her section where she talks about her methods. Macdonald does an excellent job of explaining how she chose who to talk to and who she actually spoke with. So, she's doing a case study of Ghana, but within that she's doing little mini case studies of different bureaucratic agencies. The first thing she had to do is decide which agencies to speak to and make sure that they were the right ones. So, she did expert interviews first, talking to scholars, important people within the Ghanaian civil service generally, and used those interviews to decide which agencies she would target. She talks about how she selected 4 and describes them in some detail. Then she tells you within those agencies who she actually spoke to. It would be great if she gave you exact numbers, but here what she tells you is she spoke to between 60 and 95% of the staff in these agencies. She provides you some information about the interviews themselves, which helps you judge their quality. And then she talks about what she used to compare these interviews to. She also spoke to people within agencies of lower quality than the one she spoke to, and talks about her interviews in that front. This lets you know that she put a lot of effort into identifying a strong framework for comparison. To talk a little bit about evaluating the interviews themselves, I'll just pull 2 examples from Macdonald. Her first dimension is autonomy, essentially that effective agencies in Ghana have independence from their senior leadership as opposed to following a strict hierarchy. Her description of this concept is pretty good, but the actual quotations she provides aren't as supportive of that as I would like. For example, she offers a quotation here about someone who didn't find the other bureaucratic agencies very good places to work. That's helpful information, but it doesn't really get at this idea of autonomy itself. That's what I mean when I say, do the interviews actually say what the author is describing? In this case, not so much, but when she talks about middle management and how the people who work in these agencies tend to either be very young or very experienced, she does provide stronger support. The quotation here about why this person decided to join the civil service, even though he would not be earning a lot of money, he describes the value of experience and what exactly he is looking for at that stage in his career. That's the kind of thing you need to do when evaluating these articles. First, look through how they decided who they're going to speak to, and then look at the interviews and determine whether they are genuinely supporting the author's argument. I hope this is helpful.